Good afternoon, and welcome to the Concord Bookshop. About 2 weeks ago we had Jeff Clements here, and that happened to coincide with the playoff game, and so part of my job was to let him know the score as he was going through his talk, and so I'd like to thank the NFL for arranging the Super Bowl for after Alan's talk today. God lived a pretty uncomplicated life with his Aunt Penelope and Uncle Deva. Uncomplicated it was until he decided to create the universe. Suddenly, instead of just a void, there was time and space and other issues like a mysterious stranger and morality. Should there be self-aware creatures? Should there be a free will? This and other philosophical conundrums are the heart of Alan Lightman's latest novel, Mr. G. Alan Lightman, in addition to being a distinguished Concord resident, has served on the faculties of Harvard, where he taught physics and astronomy, and MIT, where he taught both science and the humanities. He's the author of 5 previous novels and several books on science. And so without further ado, Alan Lightman.
Well, it's great to be at the Concord Bookshop. I've watched this bookshop grow over the years, and it's a real pillar of Concord and a treasure for all of us who live in Concord. Can everybody see me? I can stand up if you want me to stand up? Okay. All right. Well, in that case, maybe I'll just move this over here. I'll say a few things, a little bit about the book, and then I'll read a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit more, read a little bit more, and then you can ask questions. This is a novel. I think every culture in recorded history has had a view of God. And I thought that it would be interesting to look out of the other end of the telescope and from God's point of view and look at us. Although the us needs some qualification. There is no planet Earth in my novel. Well, there might be, but Earth is just one speck among billions of specks in the universe. And human beings don't play any particular role in the book, although there are intelligent creatures that arise after God creates the universe. I've always been interested in the intersection of science and religion. I think those are the 2 greatest forces that have shaped human civilization. And Mr. G is partly a scientist and partly an artist. So I'm just going to start reading. I think that that in fiction, as opposed to nonfiction, that it's better just to jump into the middle of things, and you want your reader to enter into the imaginary world that you're trying to create, and not give a summary of everything. If you're going to give a summary, you write nonfiction. So I'm going to just start reading from page 1, and then I'll pause for a bit and continue. As I remember, I had just woken up from a nap when I decided to create the universe. Not much was happening at that time. As a matter of fact, time didn't exist, nor space. When you looked out into the void, you were looking at nothing more than your own thought. And if you tried to picture wind or stars or water, you couldn't give form or texture to your notions. Those things didn't exist. Smooth, rough, waxy, sharp, prickly, brittle, even qualities such as these lacked meaning. Practically everything slept in an infinite torpor of potentiality. I knew that I could make whatever I wanted, but that was the problem. Unlimited possibilities bring unlimited indecision. When I thought about this particular creation or that, uncertain about how each thing would turn out, I grew anxious and went back to sleep. But at a particular moment, I managed, if not exactly to sweep aside my doubts, at least to take a chance. Almost immediately, it seemed, my Aunt Penelope asked me why I would want to do such a thing. Wasn't I comfortable with the emptiness just as it was? Yes, yes, I said, of course. You could mess things up, said my aunt. Leave him alone, said Uncle Deva. Uncle toddled over and stood beside me in his dear way. Please don't tell me what to do, retorted my aunt. Then she turned and stared hard at me. Her hair, uncombed and knotted as usual, drooped down to her bulky shoulders. Well, she said and waited. I never liked it when Aunt Penelope glowered at me. I think I'm going to do it, I finally said. It was the first decision I'd made in eons of unmeasured existence, and it felt good to have decided something. In fact, I had just created time, but unintentionally. It was just that my resolution to act, to make things, to put an end to the unceasing absence of happenings required time. By deciding to create something, I had pressed an arrow into the shapeless and unending void, an arrow that pointed in the direction of the future. Henceforth, there would be a before and an after, a continuing stream of successive events. Time necessarily came before light and dark, matter and energy, even space. Time was my first creation. See, my aunt complained when it became apparent that we were now conscious of time. I told you that you would mess things up. She shot Uncle a look of disapproval, as if he had encouraged me to act as I had. And then she began an unhappy summary of the various things that she had done and not done during the immediate past, then during the past before that, and so on, back and back through the now visible chasms of time, until Uncle begged her to stop. You should never have created the past and the future, she said. We were happy here. See, now I must say were, when before, oh, there it is again. It was nicer when everything happened at once. I can't stand to think about the future. But don't you think we have some responsibility to the future? I suggested. To all the things and beings I might create? Nonsense, shrieked Aunt Penelope. What a foolish argument. You have no responsibility to things that don't exist and won't ever exist if you could just keep your big thoughts to yourself. But it's too late now, she went on. I can feel time. I can feel the future. Aunt Penelope had gotten herself into one of her states, and the void twisted and throbbed with her displeasure. Gently, Uncle caressed her. For the first time ever, she responded to his touch. Her ranting diminished. Soon after, she realized that her hair needed combing, and that was the beginning of something, and probably all for the best. I had in mind a great number of things that I wanted to make, but with no previous experience with materiality, I could think of these things only in terms of their functions or qualities. My ideas for both animate and inanimate invention required material existence, extension, volume, and for that I needed to create space. Space did not appear all at once, but in a languorous progression, gradually increasing in length, width, and breadth. I had toyed with various numbers of dimensions. 2 seemed unnecessarily confining, in fact suffocating, while 4 or more struck me as extravagant and ran the risk of misplacing small objects. I decided I would try 3. As I recall, space first appeared in a minuscule round bubble that sat quietly in my mind. Then it stretched slightly in length, humming at a high pitch as it did so. For a time, the universe was a tiny ellipsoid. Slowly, breadth and width began to catch up with length, making an impatient clucking sound. Sphericity was restored. And then, with a sigh and a low rumble, all 3 dimensions began to unravel at once, tumbling and sprawling into the void. My universe had come into being. It was tiny at first, but beautiful, a lovely little sphere. Its surfaces were smooth and silky, yet infinitely strong. It glistened, it spun slightly, and it vibrated with energy. The energy howled and struggled to break out of those smooth, silky walls, but of course it could not, since those walls contained all that there was, except for me, Uncle Deva, and Aunt Penelope. As the combat ensued, the tiny sphere that was the universe began inflating at an alarming speed. Aunt Penelope, who in a rare moment had been quietly brushing her hair, was knocked over by the expanding sphere. "Save me!" she screamed to Uncle Deva, over-dramatizing the situation as she often did. Uncle helped right her and steadied her. "What was that thing?" she shouted. "The impertinence!" Then, without thanking Uncle, she stomped off into the void. Even though she had disappeared behind the folds and the pleats of the vacuum, I could hear my aunt muttering, "What's he done now? What's he done now? There's no end to this, no end to this, no end to this." Meanwhile, my universe was growing larger and larger. Once created, it seemed determined to become as fat as it could. I decided to make another and another. After a time, a gigantic number of universes were flying about, spinning on their axes, throbbing and pulsing, expanding and contracting at fantastic speed. My aunt was nowhere to be seen. Uncle Deva, as sympathetic as he was to my enterprise, had also ducked for cover. By and by, Aunt Penelope emerged from her hiding place, Uncle Deva from his. "You've been busy," said Uncle, looking with mild annoyance at the many universes flying about. "If I were you," said Uncle, "I wouldn't get attached to any of them. You'll just be disappointed." I took Uncle's comment under advisement. Already I was rather fond of some of the expanding spheres. "What's in those things anyway?" asked Aunt Penelope. "Space," I answered. "Humph," she said. "Well, now that we have space, I'd like, please, a chair to sit down in. I've been standing for a very long time." So I made a chair for Aunt Penelope. That chair was my first creation of matter. It had 3 curved legs and an octagonal back, and I designed it to be comfortable, but not too comfortable. My aunt sat down in it without comment. Far more awaited. I wanted to make matter. I wanted to make galaxies and stars. I wanted to make planets. I wanted to make living creatures and minds. But for the moment, I sat and I meditated, and I gazed with contentment at the empty but vibrating universes I'd made. Well, I'll stop there for just a minute, and I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the book. It's always frustrating to read just a few segments of a book because you're trying to convey the feeling of the whole book, which of course is impossible to do with a little bit. I invented, they appeared, Aunt Penelope and Uncle Deva, because I wanted Mr. G to have some people to talk to, not people, but other minds to interact with. Otherwise, we would just be getting his ruminations, which I think would get boring after a while, and also the aunt and uncle provide some comedy. Mr. G does eventually create galaxies and stars, and eventually intelligent life arises, and then the book takes a turn because the intelligent life, there's some individual creatures that Mr. G takes an interest in, and the intelligent life has various moral and ethical dilemmas. And Mr. G has debates about these intelligent creatures with a Satan-like character named Belhor. I just call him the stranger at the beginning of the book. And Belhor is another divine creature, I should say immortal creature rather than divine. Belhor and Mr. G debate over issues like good and evil, free will versus determinism, and other great philosophical issues and ethical issues as well. So Belhor gives me a chance to give Mr. G a sparring partner, another being who's an intellectual equal. I'll say a few more things after the next section. I'm going to read one more section, and then I'll say a few more things about the book and then invite some comments. This is a section that follows shortly after the last portion I read, where Belhor the stranger first appears. So the last sentence that I read before, which leads up to the new section, is, "But for the moment I sat and I meditated and I gazed with contentment at the empty but vibrating universes I'd made." I meditated, I did meditate, I am meditating, I will meditate. Now that Mr. G has created time, he likes to play with verb tenses. When I finally emerged from my meditations, a stranger was standing beside me, and beside him another creature, a fat and squat being whose countenance seemed frozen in a grin. In the unending expanse of existence, there had never been anyone but myself and Aunt Penelope and Uncle Deva. I was pleased to have another being to talk to, and yet I was not accustomed to meeting things that I hadn't made. "Good day," said the stranger. If I may take the liberty of using that expression, it will come with future creations. "I have not invited you here," I said. The stranger nodded, an acknowledgement of my comment, but without any apology. The stranger was tall and thin, and he held himself both with an ease and with a formality. "You have a congenial existence," he said. "I've recently traveled through these regions, and they impart a definite tranquility. Not that I envy you, but you do have a comfortable circumstance." "Too comfortable," said the grinning beast beside him. "Pardon Baphomet," said the stranger. "He makes a good traveling companion." He paused, and the stranger continued, "But there is a more serious question I want to ask you. Do you think it is possible for a thing and its opposite both to be true?" Despite having been startled by the stranger and his rude companion, I found myself captivated by him, even mesmerized. I decided to answer his question. "A thing and its opposite can't both be true in a rational system of thought," I replied. "But rational thoughts lead only to rational thoughts, whereas irrational thoughts lead to new experiences, said the stranger. Yes, I said. My mind encompasses both the rational and the irrational. Exactly, said the stranger. I see that we can converse with each other. As we were talking, Baphomet was doing flips and somersaults, all the while watching us with his relentless grin. Without knowing for sure, the stranger continued, I would think that you are more fluent with the rational. It does have its appeal, but the irrational permits a greater exercise of, shall we say, power, if that is your aim, of course. The stranger unfastened his gaze from me and stared out into the void. Then he turned sideways. He was so thin that he practically vanished, appearing as only a black line. These universes you created, he said, and gestured at the quivering spheres and ellipsoids flying about. Many of them will end in tragedy, or should I say, the animate matter you fill them with, the intelligent beings, will twist and suffer and meet unhappy ends. He smiled. I have no intention of that, I said. I would not allow that to happen. I'm sorry if what I've said disturbs you. I command you into non-existence, I said. I'm afraid you cannot do that, said the stranger. As tall as he was, he grew taller, as if he had been crouching. The glittering multitudes, he said, so many little lives amounting to nothing. I ask you, what is infinity multiplied by 0? It's hardly worth our discussion. Give my regards to your aunt and uncle. The stranger bowed, and then he and his beast, looking back at me with its incessant grin, moved off through the void. May I give you some advice, nephew? Said Aunt Penelope. The three of us have been wandering about in the void for some time, talking about how our existence had changed. Don't give him advice, said Uncle. He doesn't need our advice. Hush, said Aunt Penelope. I'm entitled to give advice to my nephew. Aunt Penelope took me aside, leaving Uncle by himself. Now I want you to listen to me, nephew, she said. This is no criticism, but your uncle and I have always been impressed with you. But we are your elders, and we do notice what goes on here. You shouldn't do things with such haste. You rush into things. Slow down. Take your time with this project. I hadn't been aware I was rushing, I said to my aunt. All these things flying about, said Aunt. You made them so quickly. Why don't you concentrate on just one of your universes and see if you can do a good job with it? That's excellent advice, said Uncle Deva, standing some distance away. Which one would you like? I asked my aunt. It was not a serious question. There were trillions of spheres and hyperboloids flying about, by now having inflated trillions of times larger than they were just a few moments ago. This one, said my aunt, and she suddenly reached up and caught one of the spheres flying past. Work on this one. We have confidence in you, your uncle and I, and we're certain that you can do well with it, now that you've started this project. Just take your time. That's all I'm suggesting. Well, now in the narrative, and I'm going to read you one more scene, but I just wanted to tell you that at this point in the narrative, Mr. G creates matter and stars and galaxies. Eons pass, and then intelligent life arises, and it arises completely by accident without Mr. G's intervention. Once atoms and molecules are formed, they collide with each other in random collisions, billions and billions of times per second, And just by accident, the molecules are constantly reforming themselves as they collide with each other, changing their composition. And by accident, a molecule forms that can replicate itself, can duplicate itself, and that becomes DNA. And eons later, another accident occurs, and the DNA-type molecule gets surrounded by other molecules that can permit materials to come in and out, and that forms the walls of a biological cell. And just by accidents like these, eventually life emerges, and eventually intelligent life emerges, and eventually matter, minds emerge, beings with intelligence. Meanwhile, Mr. G and Aunt Penelope and Uncle Deva make many trips into the new universe. They visit the various civilizations that are being created and destroyed on planets. They visit the intelligent life, always invisibly. And so I'm going to read you a scene that comes later. Billions of years have passed now since the scene that I read you before. So this is really a great family saga here, encompassing billions of years and not just 5 generations. So this is I'll read you one more scene. There were other things that we in the void picked up from the new universe. Birthdays, for example. We thought birthdays were delightful. Aunt P and Uncle D began planning birthday parties for themselves, although choosing a date and an interval of time between birthdays was a bit problematic. Following one of our excursions into the new universe and back, Aunt P suddenly announced that she was having a birthday party after her next sleep, and she expected presents. And I don't want any items from the void made out of nothingness, she quipped. I've got plenty of nothing already. I want something material. You understand what I'm saying? A birthday party is a splendid idea, said Uncle D. But about the presents, I don't... No buts, said Aunt P. I'm going for my beauty rest now, and when I wake up, I want presents, lots of them. You've got a whole universe full of stuff to choose from, and I want something pink. With that, Aunt P yawned and retired. A difficult spouse, Uncle whispered to me in exasperation, but what can you do? So Uncle and I went into the universe and found a newly forming galaxy full of pink stars, and we carried it back to the void. In the void, the material was nearly weightless. It shimmered and glowed. You could almost see through it. With a few folds and tucks, we made a beautiful dress for Aunt Penelope, as she'd always wanted. Uncle named the dress Kalyana. He said nothing about the mismatch of essences between the material universe and the immaterial void, as he had in mind a few material things he wanted for his birthday, which he informed me was coming up quite soon. Oh my, Aunt P exclaimed when she woke up and saw the dress draped over an outcropping of the void. It's lovely. You shouldn't have gone to the trouble. Immediately she put on the garment. Then she studied herself for a few moments. She turned this way and that, exclaimed again, and began dancing about and singing at the same time. Although there were many pink stars, there were also blue and yellow and green ones. It was a dress of many colors. Wearing it, Aunt Penelope was the most beautiful thing in the void. Every time she twirled, a few stars came loose and began sailing off, and Uncle would shuffle over and scoop them up and stick them back on. For eons, Aunt P never took that dress off, even for sleeping. It lasted about 1 billion trillion atomic ticks. After that, most of the stars had exploded or burned out, and the garment lost its color and shape. Thank you. Well, I'd be happy to.
I have a question.
Yes. Does somebody have a
I have a
question?
question.
Yes.
I'm raised in Cambridge at Harvard Divinity School and also at the NASA lab at MIT.
Mhm.
And when I listen to this story, I actually have a son that's a freshman in college. And to tell you the truth, I would rate this storyline in this English about 6th grade. And I'm wondering what grade you intended or age group.
I intended to be for adults.
Over 25 and graduated
Well,
from
I
Harvard?
think high school students could read it.
I agree, they could read it.
Yeah, but high school students could read it, but I wrote it for adults. I mean, it has some philosophical issues that I think would appeal to adults, but I think it could also be read by younger people as well. Yeah.
The philosophical issue that just goes through my mind as I hear you reading this is just consciousness. What is consciousness?
Well, yes.
That's wonderful.
Mr. G does deal with consciousness later on, which is one of the great unsolved problems in science. That is in earthly science. And he is totally amazed at how consciousness arises. Although Mr. G is all-powerful, he's not omniscient, and he can't always predict the consequences of his actions, and he actually is amazed at how life develops and evolves, and especially consciousness. And so there's a scene where he does an experiment and tries to find out what consciousness is, and he creates a brain one neuron at a time and tries to find out the point when you have a critical mass of neurons when consciousness comes about.
I love it.
Yes.
Yes, Alan, does Mr. G have any conversations with organized religion?
No, he doesn't have conversations with anybody in the universe. He has long debates with Belhor about whether he should enter the universe and actually, not enter the universe, but actually intervene to alter events. And he eventually decides not to alter events, to just be a spectator. But he does observe religions being developed in various civilizations and different planets, and he is very sympathetic to religions. He's sympathetic to the endeavor to understand the unknowable, and his aunt keeps telling him, well, these religions are wasting their time because there's no way they can understand the void, understand the infinite, understand immortality. These are all mortal creatures who are imagining what you're like, but there's no way they can imagine what you're like. And Mr. G's response to that is that it's true that they cannot imagine infinity or immortality, but there's something transcendent about their attempt to imagine it and attempt to understand the mysterious. So he has a sympathetic attitude towards, he being Mr. G, has a sympathetic attitude towards religions. Yes.
I understand your decision to have an uncle and aunt, but the implication of that is there must be other Mr. G's around. Are you implying that there are other? No,
there are no other beings who inhabit the void except Mr. G and his uncle and aunt. That's it. That's it. Yes.
Is this, in your mind, a new, more advanced version of Genesis?
Well, I wouldn't. I wouldn't pretend to be presenting. I mean, it's a literary work, and it's a literary
Well, so is the Bible
version
a literary
of
version.
Genesis. It's an imaginative
Yeah.
thing. But what one of the things that interested me about writing the book was just the intersection of science and religion, Mr. G does create the universe according to scientific principles, and the evolution of life follows our best thinking in science, and yet it's not all science, because Mr. G and his aunt and uncle live outside of time and space in the void. So it's this juxtaposition. It's a version of religion that is completely compatible with science.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
How did the stranger come into being? Presumably quantum mechanics applied to the void, and he's the anti-Mr. G?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know exactly how the stranger came into being. But there's a point later in the book where Mr. G again tries to do away with him, and the stranger says that you can't do away with me without doing away with the universe.
Yeah.
That when you created the universe, I came into being. And the stranger, in some ways, is like the dark side of Mr. G. The stranger argues, for example, a later part of the book, that evil must exist in the world. If you have good, you must have evil, that these qualities go together. There's no such thing as absolute good. It's all relative, and therefore you must have evil as a contrast. So that they're Mr. Belhor, the stranger, seems to be an inevitable consequence of the creation of the universe. But beyond that, I don't know. Yes.
Is Mr. G's awareness equal of what's going on? He's observing the universe. Is it everything that's going on, or is it selective? And
He can see everything that's going on.
So when he's judging
He can see everything. He can see everything. He can't necessarily predict the way everything is going to evolve, but he can see everything.
Are there times when he doesn't, where his attention gets diverted? And so it
well,
becomes
he's
selective?
Yes, I mean, he's not always giving equal attention to everything that's going on, but he can see everything, and he can see it all at once if he chooses to. Henry.
In your creative process, you must have continually, in some way, been referring back to the book of Genesis.
Yes.
And yet I find myself, as I fancy this, you've turned one little piece upside down. And that is, he's created chaos out of order. Will you comment on that?
Well, I don't. When you say he's created chaos out of order, what do you mean by that? Well, he being Mr. G?
Yeah.
So how did?
Yeah. Take DNA, for example. The multiplicity of possibilities from DNA, in some sense, is creating chaos out of order.
Entropy.
Yes. Well, the universe does obey the second law of thermodynamics, so it is getting more disordered in time. So if that's what you're referring to, yes. There are references. You mentioned again Genesis. There are references at various points along the way that echo lines in the Bible, and that's like the Bible. I mean the Western Bible. And there are names of people that are drawn from traditions of Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Judaism. So even though planet Earth plays no role in the book, I do take some pleasure in making references to some of the religious and intellectual traditions of the planet that we live in. Yes.
Now, your view of good and evil seems to be Manichaean rather than Augustinian. By that I mean you have given evil a separate existence, whereas Augustine would say evil is merely the absence of goodness.
Well, I think that evil being the absence of goodness would be in line with the view of Belhor, that the stranger, who is the Satan-like character, who does say that you can't have one without the other, that they're related, that they're relative to each other. So it seems to me that that's in line with the second version that you just stated.
Well, we could argue about that.
Yes. I'll get Mr. G to argue for me.
Alan, I'm interested in the relation of this book to your long poem, in which there's a very particular individual, even if we don't know his name exactly, who's asking the questions without answers about the universe. And here we have. When did you start thinking about this one? How does it relate to the long poem?
Well, I've always been interested in the big questions. And I think that a lot of the big questions cannot be answered. And that's one of the things that interests me about them. Particularly coming with one foot in the world of science, where science does deal with questions that have answers, even though it might take a decade or 100 years to answer the question. At any given time, every scientist is working on a question that he or she believes has an answer. Whereas you also learn, if you live in the world, that there are other interesting questions that don't have answers, and I think both the questions with answers and the questions without answers are necessary, and both part of what make us human. And so some of the philosophical questions that you're referring to are in a lot of my work. I just like to try to find different ways of asking the questions.
I wondered if you had been thinking about this book for a long time.
I have been thinking about it for a long time, yeah, and I'm sure that I was thinking about it at the time that I wrote the long poem as well.
Did Einstein say that everything that counts cannot be counted, and everything that cannot be counted counts?
I don't know whether he said that, but that's a wonderful line. That's a wonderful line. I like that. Yes.
Did you give any thought to when gravity came in? I noticed that the characters sit down in chairs.
Yes. Right.
There must have been a down.
Great question. Yes. Well, to actually say that she sat down, that's a wonderful point that you make. Yeah.
He made the chair.
Can you describe the chair?
Well, I guess it could be down towards the bottom half of her, whether there's gravity or not. But you're right. Yeah, gravity does come in, of course. I mean, when the first stars start forming, they form from gravitational attraction of masses of gas. So yes.
So I wonder, when you start writing a book like this, do you think when are you going to introduce these other concepts?
Well, I tried to put myself in the mind of Mr. G. And everything. There's a grand narrative to the book, and the grand narrative is the one that takes 20 billion years, which is the creation and eventual demise of the universe. And so we do know when certain things happened from our study of cosmology. Of course, if that was the only narrative of the book, I think it wouldn't be. It would be a science book. It wouldn't be so interesting. There are smaller narratives that deal with the relationship between Mr. G and his aunt and uncle, with his conversations with the Satan-like figure. Once intelligent life arises, there are small stories that deal with individual creatures that are made. And also, Mr. G himself changes in the book, and I think that one thing that we all demand as readers of fiction to find something satisfying, a novel, is we want the main characters to undergo a change, whether it's a psychological change or some kind of emotional change. And Mr. G actually does undergo a change. He learns things from his creation. He learns that there is suffering in the universe, and he is constantly questioning whether the suffering is necessary. And he's at a different point at the end of the book than he was at the beginning of the book. At the beginning of the book, he's just been sleeping for eons and eons and eons. Yes, Eric.
Alan, could you say a little bit about the writing of the book? How long did it take you? When did you decide, or how, that there ought to be an aunt and an uncle? And then you say you've taken up a group of sort of philosophical issues, of which there's a nearly infinite number. When did you decide enough is enough and I'm going to end the book?
Well, the book almost wrote itself, and I'm almost guilty about how it came about. I think I spent only a year writing it, which is a very short time for writing a book. I knew what the grand narrative was when I started, because I do know that the standard story of cosmology that our physicists and astronomers tell us. The characters, I realized pretty early on that Mr. G needed other characters to relate to make the book interesting, because I wanted to have some serious philosophical and theological issues in the book. I also knew I needed comedy to offset that. But after sort of those general considerations, I just tried to follow the logical, what Mr. G would do. It was an amazing feeling trying to inhabit the mind of Mr. G. And I actually confessed that I did feel kind of powerful. I did have, a tiny glimmer of a sense of having a huge amount of power. I wish I could have predicted the stock market with that power or something, but it was an interesting experience. But it didn't take more than a year to write. Yep.
I get the multiverses you were referring to. What other aspects of more recent cosmological developments did you pull into the book?
Well, I would say the multiverse, the fact of many universes, is the most recent. The rest of it sort of follows traditional thinking in the sciences.
Dark energy now and the expansion of the universe, and constant energy or not, anything like that?
Well, there's a little bit of that in the book. The book is definitely not a science book. I didn't want it to feel like a lecture in Physics 101 or anything like that. So the science that's in the book I try to put in lightly. I tried to do it in a poetic manner, and I didn't want it to feel like you were getting a heavy dose of science.
In that context, did you feel constrained to select this universe, since this is the one we're in, as opposed to one of the other universes?
Well, I wanted it to be a universe that allowed the emergence of life, because life is what's interesting to a reader, to most readers. Most of the universes would not permit the existence of life. They wouldn't have the right conditions, etc. So I focused on a universe that would allow the emergence of life. And so the universe that Mr. G deals with, that his aunt plucks from the whizzing void, that is a universe that's like our universe. It could be our universe. It could definitely be our universe. Yes.
I'm trying to think how to frame this. Whether I was listening to the first question or I had a different reaction to your book, and I haven't read it yet. Just reading that it was something you could read to children in a wonderful way, particularly the description about the dress. And I was thinking about small children and how magical this is. But another part of what I heard in the simple language was a kind of tongue-in-cheek approach to these big questions. And so what I'm really wondering is, you know, as a writer, you're omniscient. Some people say God is among all of us. In other words, that we didn't create the earth, but this concept of God is something very universal. And so I'm really curious about, ultimately, are these unanswerable questions, and it's more of a tongue-in-cheek attempt at saying I can try as an author to, you know, explore these with you, the reader, but, you know, not that it's futile, but that it's really almost laughable. So how?
No, the questions are serious in the book. There's a very serious side of the book, and even there's humor. But I mean, in my reading of it, the questions are serious, and I don't make fun of the questions. I don't treat the questions comically. Mr. G, although he is a humble fellow, he does really grapple with some of these issues in a serious way. And you would have to read the book to get that. The parts that I read were among the more comic, but there are serious issues in the book, and they're treated in a serious way. Yeah.
Do you think of yourself as writing out of various philosophical traditions when you address these questions?
Of course. Unavoidable.
Okay.
I mean, we're all products of everything that we read and learn. So I haven't introduced any new philosophical issues in the book. They're all issues that human beings have worried about for centuries. They're presented in a new context here because they're coming in the musings and reflections of the Creator. But I haven't introduced new philosophical issues. So definitely, yes.
Mr. G and his family, they all seem to be described as being inherently human. But why would you choose humans to make your characters instead of anything?
Well, the only physical characteristic that is mentioned of Mr. G, his uncle or aunt, is the hair of the aunt. And there's no other physical characteristic that's mentioned. So I think of Mr. G and Aunt Penelope and Uncle Deva as being sort of disembodied forms. You have to make their voices and concerns human for it to be interesting to a reader. I mean, I could have written this book in binary bits, and I could say this is much more in keeping with the mind of God, but you wouldn't be able to read it. And in the same way, if the characters didn't have something that you could relate to, I mean, you can call it human. You have to get emotionally involved with characters in a novel, or else the novel doesn't have an emotional impact on you. And I know I'm saying that in a rational way. You know, if there were another kind of writer here, he or she would say it in a more literary way, but I'm saying it in the way that I understand it. And you have to be able to relate to the characters to have an emotional involvement with them. So that's why I gave characteristics to Aunt Penelope and Uncle Deva and Mr. G that we can recognize as and from our own experience with life. Yes.
What genre is this book? Science fiction, fantasy, utopia?
I don't know.
I don't either.
It's fiction. But other than that, I don't know My book, Einstein's Dreams, which came out almost 20 years ago, which is a bunch of imaginary dreams that Einstein might have had about the way that time behaves, that was not accepted by the science fiction community as a science fiction book. And I suspect that this one would also not be considered to be science fiction by the community of science fiction people. Yeah.
I haven't read it yet. I'm intending on reading it, but I think I'm going to like it for the same reasons as Einstein's Dreams. It seems like what you're saying is that he does change, and that there is an arc, and he is dynamic, and you do care about him, and that part of what the moral big questions, because you made a hint at it, you said at the end it ends, or you said the universe is end. And so I think if any of us haven't gotten to the end, we can't see the full arc of it yet. I think that there's going to be, I'm anticipating, as with the dreams, that there are going to be these deep, lingering, quick but deep conversations that will
well, I hope so.
engage on many levels. Well, I would call it science literature. I just proposed a course and I have it accepted called science literature, and I think that's what this is.
It's a very similar feeling.
What was the question?
The question was, is there a difference in the creative process or the feeling of creating in science and in literature, as a writer or as a scientist? Does it feel different when you're creating something, when you're discovering something? And my experience is that it feels the same. That and I think everybody here has probably had some creative moments, and you know that what it feels like is you lose all sense of your body, you lose sense of time, you lose sense of your ego. You just get into that state of just being and seeing, and it's the most magnificent experience there is, and that's the sensation that I have both when I'm doing good science and writing well. And I wish that those moments lasted longer.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. To answer your question, we were very, very happy to put it into literary fiction when we classified it.